The perfume you wore in 1985 does not smell the way it used to. You're not imagining it, and your nose is not failing you. They changed it, quietly, a little at a time, and nobody sent you a letter. I've worn some of these for 30 years, and I can tell you the exact season each one went thin on me. You stood at the counter, you sprayed the bottle you'd worn since you were a young woman, and something was not there, a shadow where a depth used to be. You went home and you wondered if it was you. It was not you. You've spent decades trusting your own nose. You know the difference between a room that smells expensive and a room that simply cost a lot of money. So you, of all people, would notice when a great fragrance loses a half-inch of its soul. I'm Vivienne Marchand. I've been buying, wearing, and studying perfume since I was a young woman, and I have stood at every counter there is and watched the classics quietly become something slightly other than themselves. Now, before we go a step further, a quick word, because this one matters more than most. Everything I'm about to tell you is my opinion and general information, not medical advice, and certainly not a verdict on any house. When I say a fragrance smells wrong to me now, that is my nose talking, and your nose is the final judge. And I want to be very clear about one thing from the start, because the internet is not. Nobody poisoned your perfume. The changes I'm going to describe were made, for the most part, because the people who set the rules for fragrance decided that certain natural ingredients can irritate sensitive skin, and they restricted them. That is allergen safety regulation. It is not a health scare, and I will not pretend it is one to sell you a story. So why does the industry let it happen so quietly? Follow the money for a moment. A reformulation costs a house far less than the original ever did. The rare natural materials are expensive and getting scarcer. The synthetic replacements are cheaper, more stable, more consistent batch to batch, and the bottle on your shelf, the one you trusted, is worth a great deal to a brand precisely because you trust it. So they keep the name, they keep the bottle, they keep the campaign, and they let the inside change. By the end of this, you'll know which classics were altered, why, and which of them still hold a shadow of what they were. But first, the real reason so many of the great ones lost their soul. And it isn't only greed. What most women get wrong is the assumption that a perfume is a fixed thing, like a painting, that once it is made, it stays made. It isn't. A perfume is a recipe, and a recipe depends on its ingredients. And over the last 40 years, the list of ingredients a perfumer is allowed to use freely has been quietly rewritten. An industry body called the International Fragrance Association, which most people have never heard of, restricts materials that can cause skin sensitization. Oakmoss, certain spice molecules, certain musks, bergamot. One by one, the very things that gave the old classics their weight and their shadow were capped or removed. So the houses had a choice: reformulate or stop selling the perfume in most of the world. They reformulated. That is the part nobody puts on the box. And I want you to hold on to a particular idea as we go, because it explains the grief better than anything else I can give you. A great perfume is a 3-act composition. The top notes are the first act, the bright opening that greets you. The heart is the second act. And the base, the dry down, the part that lingers on your wrist hours later, that is the third act, and it is almost always where the soul of the thing lives. Now here is the cruelty of the modern rules. The materials that have been restricted most heavily, oak moss, the old musks, certain resins, are base materials. Third act materials. So when a classic gets reformulated, the part that survives best is usually the bright opening you smell in the store. And the part that quietly thins is the deep, warm, lingering finish you actually fell in love with. The handshake stays. The embrace gets lighter. That is why so many of these still smell almost right for the first 10 minutes, and not quite right by evening. There was a woman I knew years ago in Lyon named Eleanor. She wore one fragrance for 40 years, the same one, and she was the most quietly elegant woman I have ever stood next to. When I was young, I asked her once what it was, and she told me, and she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Buy it now, because they will not leave it alone. They never leave the good ones alone." I thought she was being dramatic. She was a woman who had lived through more than I had, and she was right, and I was the one who didn't understand yet. By the time I went looking for her fragrance in its old form, the old form was gone. There was a bottle with the same name on it, and it was a perfectly nice perfume, and it was not the thing Eleanor wore. That is the day I started paying attention to this. That is the day I understood what she meant. Let me show you what she meant. Let me start with the most famous bottle in the world. Chanel No. 5, pronounced as you'd expect. Chanel. Created in 1921 by Ernest Bowes, and arguably the single most recognizable fragrance ever composed. Aldehydes, a great bouquet of jasmine and rose, and underneath it, a chypre-leaning base built in part on oakmoss, a base that gave the old No. 5 a creaminess and a depth that people who knew it never quite forget. Here is what happened. Oakmoss, the real material, contains two molecules, atronol and chloroatronol, that the European authorities flagged as significant skin allergens. So the houses, Chanel among them, moved to versions of oakmoss with those molecules stripped out, and they leaned harder on synthetic musks and softened the aldehydes. To my nose, the modern No. 5 is cleaner, lighter, more transparent, and a little less of itself. The old creaminess, that almost edible warmth in the dry down, is quieter than it was. I want to be fair, because this is important. The modern No. 5 is still a beautiful, beautifully made perfume, and a great many women genuinely prefer the cleaner version. That is a real opinion, not a consolation prize. But if you are one of the women who remembers the No. 5 of decades ago and finds the current one thinner, you are not wrong, and you are not old in the nose. The base was changed for allergen reasons, and you can smell it. That part is simply true. Now, let me stop on something here because it's the heart of this whole conversation. The woman the counter loves is the woman who buys the name and never asks what's inside it, because the name does the reassuring for her. The woman I'm talking to is the one who can stand at that counter, spray the famous bottle, and know within 10 seconds that the inside has moved, even when the label swears nothing has. That is not cynicism. That is a trained nose doing exactly what a lifetime trained it to do. Trust it. It is telling you the truth the marketing won't. The second one is harder for me because I loved it. Yves Saint Laurent Opium. Created in 1977, a great smoky oriental, allspice and resin and warmth, and at the very center of it, a carnation heart built on clove. Clove gets its scent from a molecule called eugenol, and its cousin, iso-eugenol, and both of those were restricted by the fragrance authorities as skin sensitizers. You cannot build that old blazing carnation heart at the old strength anymore. In 2009, Yves Saint Laurent discontinued the original and reintroduced a new version, and the house changed hands and changed direction more than once over the years besides. To my nose, the modern opium is smoother, more polite, less dangerous than the one I wore in the 80s. The spice that used to feel almost lit, almost burning, has been turned down. Now, here is my honesty beat, and I owe it to you. I have to be careful that my memory is not romanticizing. We remember the perfumes of our youth wrapped in everything else we felt back then, and the nose is a sentimental instrument. Some of what I miss in old opium is old opium, and some of it, if I'm honest, is being 30. I can't fully separate the two, and anyone who tells you they can with perfect certainty is selling you something. What I can tell you is that the formula genuinely changed, the clove was genuinely restricted, and those are facts. The rest is me and a bottle and a decade I'm fond of. Let me give you a moment, and then the third one, because the third one is quieter and sadder in its way. The third is Dior Diorissimo. Diorissimo, D or E-E-Simo. Created in 1956 by Edmond Rudnitska, and it is the great Lily of the Valley perfume, the one perfumers point to when they want to show you what muguet, the French word for lily of the valley, can be. Here is the cruelty of it. Lily of the valley, as a flower, yields almost no usable oil. You cannot really extract it. So the whole scent was built around a molecule called hydroxycitronellyl, which is what gave Diarissimo its uncanny living flower quality. And hydroxycitronellyl is exactly the kind of material the safety authorities have steadily restricted as a sensitizer, along with the later lily-of-the-valley synthetics like Lirol, which was banned in the European Union outright. So the modern Diarissimo had to be rebuilt around newer, permitted muguet molecules. To my nose, it is brighter, greener, a touch more synthetic, and it has lost a little of that trembling, dewy realism that made the original feel like a flower someone had just cut. The reformulators worked hard, and the result is honestly clever. But the soul of it, that wet green living quality, is harder to find now. And again, this was not malice. The material that made the magic happened to be one that can irritate skin. The rule came down. The flower went a little plastic. That is the whole sad story. And I'll add one honest thing for the women who only know the current Diarissimo and love it. If you've never smelled the old one, you have not lost anything, and you should wear yours happily. The grief in this video is the grief of memory. You cannot mourn a thing you never held. There's a mercy in that, and I mean it kindly. Here is where it gets interesting, because the fourth one has been changed more times than almost any fragrance alive, and most women who wear it have no idea. Guerlain Shalimar, Guerlain, Guerlain, Shalimar, Shalimar. Created in 1925 by Jacques Guerlain, the first great oriental, bergamot, and citrus up top falling into a vast warm dry down of vanilla and iris and leather, and something animalic underneath. And that animalic underneath is exactly the point. Shalimar has reportedly been adjusted dozens of times across its century, but the meaningful reformulations came with the big allergen restrictions, with significant changes around 2010 and again around 2015. Several things got reined in at once. The raw bergamot, because untreated citrus oils are phototoxic, meaning they can make skin react in sunlight. So the industry uses a treated, cleaned-up bergamot now. The animalic notes, the old musks that gave it that human, skin-on-skin warmth, several of which were the so-called nitro-musks that fell out of use over the 90s for safety and environmental reasons. And the oakmoss, again. To my nose, the modern Shalimar leans harder on the vanilla and the iris, and the old, smoky, leathery, almost improper warmth at the base is gentler, more groomed than it was. Is it still gorgeous? It genuinely is. The extrait especially is still spoken of as the gold standard. But the vintage had a darkness to it, an animal honesty that the modern one has had professionally softened. For allergen and safety reasons that are, I'll say it plainly, entirely legitimate. Your skin reacting to sunlight is a real thing. The rule is not the villain here. It just costs us something, and it's allowed to cost us something quietly. And the fifth one is not a single perfume. It is the grandmother of an entire family, and it is the one that proves the whole point. Coty, Chypre, Coty, the house spelled C-O-T-Y, Chypre, Chypre, created in 1917 by François Coty, and this is the one that started everything. The word Chypre, which you will see on perfume after perfume, comes from this bottle. François Coty took bergamot and oakmoss and labdanum and built the first great three-part structure, bright citrus collapsing into deep mossy shadow, and nearly every sophisticated perfume of the next 50 years, Mitsuko among them, descends from what he did here, and it is essentially gone. The original Coty Chypre was discontinued back in the 1960s, and the version that turned up later, in the 1980s, in the drugstore reformulations, is, by most serious accounts, not really a reformulation at all, but a different fragrance wearing the old name. And the reason the true original can never simply come back is the reason behind everything I've told you today. You cannot legally build that base anymore. The oak moss that was the entire foundation of it is restricted to a level where the old structure is impossible. So the founding fragrance of an entire genre exists now mostly in vintage bottles, hunted by collectors, and in its grandchildren. That is the part that stays with me. It is not that one perfume changed. It is that the floor the whole house was built on was quietly taken away, for reasons that are real, and most of the people standing on that floor never felt it move. Let me be honest with you one more time, because I promised you I would. I am not telling you any of these is toxic. I am not telling you any of them was banned in America, because that is not what happened, and you will hear people say it, and they are wrong. I am not telling you to throw anything away or stop wearing what you love. Several of these reformulated versions are, on their own terms, lovely, and a great many noses honestly prefer the cleaner, lighter, modern versions, and those noses are not fools. What I am telling you is the unglamorous truth, that the marketing leaves off the box. The classics were changed, mostly for allergen safety reasons, partly for cost, partly because the raw materials are vanishing, partly because houses change hands and lose the thread. Your memory of how they used to smell is, in the ways that matter, accurate. And if you want the old soul, your best chance is a carefully kept vintage bottle. Or, in some cases, the Parfum, the extrait concentration, which often holds the old character longer than the lighter eau de toilette. That is not nostalgia talking. That is just where the shadow still lives. Now, tell me in the comments which classic you noticed change. And when you noticed it, what were you wearing the day you sprayed it and thought, this is not the same? I want to build a real record from real women, real noses, so the next woman who finds this and thinks she's losing her mind knows she is not. Your account of when your fragrance shifted is genuinely more valuable than anything a brand will ever publish. So leave it. Name the perfume, name the year, help the next woman. Next time, I'm going to take you back to something that sat on nearly every dressing table before 1958, a way women made one bottle last and project that the industry quietly replaced with a shelf of products that cost more and do less. Once you know how they did it, you will never look at the counter the same way again. You're going to want to hear that one. Until next time, let the counter keep its secrets. You've spent a lifetime training your nose, and what you wear should reflect you, not someone else's marketing budget.